When Julian Hayes sat at table 7 in Bella Rosa restaurant at 7:32 p.m. on a Friday evening that had started with optimism but was rapidly dissolving into familiar disappointment, checking his watch for the fourth time in 15 minutes with the kind of precision that had made him a successful architect, but a failure at spontaneity, waiting for his blind date Natalie Brooks, who was now 32 minutes late without so much as a text explaining the delay or apologizing for keeping him waiting, already composing in his head the polite but firm message he'd sent his friend Derek, who'd set this up. The message that would say something diplomatic about having waited but needing to leave, about appreciating the effort but recognizing when things weren't meant to be. Heidi already standing from his chair and raising one hand to signal the waiter that he'd need his coat and would be settling the bill for the single glass of wine he'd nursed for half an hour. He thought this was just another failed attempt at dating in a city where everyone seemed to be looking for something he couldn't provide. Another evening wasted when he could have been home working on the designs for the museum project that was due Monday. Another reminder that finding genuine connection at 38 years old in a world of dating apps and manufactured meet cutes was infinitely harder than it should be for someone who had a good job and a nice apartment, and friends who insisted he was a catch, despite all evidence to the contrary. But it wasn't just another failed date that would become an amusing anecdote he'd tell Derek over drinks while explaining why he was done with blind dates forever. Wasn't just another woman who decided he wasn't worth showing up for, or who'd gotten cold feet and ghosted him rather than having the courtesy to cancel. Wasn't a wasted evening that would end with him going home alone to his empty loft and wondering why his ex-wife had been right when she said he'd prioritized his career over building a life with another person. It wasn't going to end the way he expected, with him walking out of Bella Rosa into the cool evening air, feeling a mixture of relief at escaping another awkward dinner and resignation that maybe he was meant to be alone. Plus, that maybe the window for finding lasting connection had closed 3 years ago when his marriage had ended, and he'd promised himself he'd do better next time, but had never quite figured out what better actually looked like. Because when Natalie Brooks finally rushed through the restaurant entrance at 7:33 p.m., breathless and flushed and clearly mortified, her hair escaping from what had probably been a neat bun that morning, but was now barely holding together after what must have been a chaotic evening, with her 7-year-old deaf daughter Grace holding tightly to her hand, with the kind of grip that suggested the child was both protective of her mother and uncertain about this strange environment. Shortly after Natalie's babysitter had called at 6:45 p.m. to cancel with a family emergency that left Natalie with impossible choice between missing the first date she'd had in 5 years or bringing her daughter along, and hoping that whoever this Julian person was would be understanding rather than immediately making excuses to leave the way most men did when confronted with the reality that dating a single mother meant dating a package deal. When Grace looked directly at Julian with those serious brown eyes that seemed to see through all the polite social masks adults wore to protect themselves, studied him with the kind of intense focus that only children and artists possess, the ability to look past surface presentations to something deeper and more essential. Amrina signed to her mother with small, careful hands that moved through the air with practiced fluency. "He has kind eyes, Mommy." Words that Natalie translated in a whisper that carried both surprise and something that looked like cautious hope. What Julian did next would teach him that sometimes the connections you're meant to find come with unexpected additions that transform everything you thought you knew about what family could look like. That the best relationships aren't the ones that fit neatly into the plans you made, but the ones that explode those plans entirely and rebuild them into something better. That being seen by a child who communicates without words but observes everything can change your understanding of yourself in ways that years of therapy and self-reflection never quite managed. But if you believe that real love often comes in unexpected packages that look nothing like what you imagined when you were younger and thought you had everything figured out, that children possess the ability to see truth that adults have learned to hide behind politeness and self-protection and fear of vulnerability, that kindness is a language everyone understands regardless of whether words are spoken or signed or simply demonstrated through the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Please like this video right now. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances and the possibility that what you're looking for might arrive in forms you never anticipated. And comment below where you're watching from, because every share helps stories about authentic connection reach people who've stopped believing that love can surprise them, who've decided that their chance is past, who need to know that sometimes the best things happen when all your careful plans fall apart and you're forced to improvise based on nothing more than a child's observation that you have kind eyes. Julian Hayes was 38 years old and an architect who specialized in designing museums and cultural centers, buildings that were supposed to inspire and elevate the human spirit. Buildings that won awards and got featured in architectural journals and made clients happy, even though Julian himself felt increasingly disconnected from the passion that had driven him into architecture in the first place. He'd been divorced for 3 years after a marriage that had lasted 7 years and had ended not with dramatic fights or discovered betrayals, but with the slow erosion of connection that happened when two people wanted fundamentally different things, and neither was willing to compromise until it was too late to save what they'd built together. His ex-wife had wanted children, had wanted them desperately in ways that became clearer with each passing year of their marriage, had wanted to start a family while they were still young enough to enjoy it, had painted pictures of a future filled with soccer games and school plays and family vacations that required minivans and patience and the willingness to let your life be shaped by small humans with their own needs and schedules. Julian had said not yet, had said he needed to establish his career first, had said there would be time for children later after he'd made partner at the firm and built the reputation that would give them financial security, had made 1,000 small choices that prioritized professional achievement over personal connection until his wife had finally accepted that later would never come and had left to find someone who wanted the same future she wanted. He regretted that choice now with the kind of profound regret that settled into your bones and reminded you of your failures every time you walked past a playground or saw a father carrying a sleeping child. He regretted it not because he'd suddenly developed a burning desire to be a parent, but because he lost someone he loved by being too rigid to imagine a life that looked different from the plan he'd made when he was 25 and thought success meant a corner office and buildings with his name attached to them. His friend Derek had set up this blind date after months of gentle pressure about how Julian needed to get back out there, needed to stop using work as an excuse to avoid vulnerability, needed to take a chance on connection even though his last attempt at building a life with someone had ended in divorce and regret. Julian had agreed reluctantly. Hannah had showed up at Bella Rosa 30 minutes early because being punctual was one of the few things he could still control in a life that increasingly felt like it was happening to him rather than being shaped by him, had chosen this restaurant because it was nice enough to show effort, but casual enough to not feel like too much pressure. He was about to leave when Natalie arrived late because 32 minutes felt like a clear message that she wasn't interested, that she had probably taken one look at his profile photo and decided he wasn't worth her time, that this was the universe telling him to go home and stop pretending he was capable of the kind of spontaneity and flexibility that relationships required. He didn't know about Grace, had no idea that his blind date came with a 7-year-old daughter, or had never been told because Natalie's well-meaning friend had decided that information was better revealed in person rather than scaring off potential dates before they even met. Natalie Brooks was 35 years old and a graphic designer who worked freelance because freelance meant flexible hours that allowed her to be present for Grace in ways that traditional employment never could. Meant she could work from home while Grace did her homework, or take breaks to drive Grace to speech therapy or doctor's appointments, or the dozens of other commitments that came with raising a child with special needs. She had a 7-year-old deaf daughter named Grace, who'd been born deaf due to genetic factors no one could have predicted or prevented, whose diagnosis at 6 months old had transformed Natalie's understanding of what motherhood would require, whose needs had become the organizing principle around which Natalie built every other aspect of her life. Natalie's husband had left when Grace was 2 years old, had stuck around for the initial diagnosis in the first round of appointments with specialists and audiologists, had participated in learning basic sign language and adapting their home and their expectations, but had eventually admitted that this wasn't the life he'd signed up for, that he couldn't handle the stress and the financial burden and the reality that their daughter would always be different, would always require extra support, would always mark their family as other in ways he wasn't prepared to accept. And he'd left with apologies that felt hollow and promises to stay involved that had dissolved within months, had remarried within 2 years to a woman whose children were typically developing and whose life didn't require the constant navigation that came with disability, had sent child support checks that barely covered a fraction of Grace's needs, but apparently satisfied his legal obligations, if not his moral ones. Natalie hadn't dated in 5 years, hadn't even considered it because dating as a single mother was complicated enough without adding the dimension of having a child who was deaf, who communicated through sign language that most people didn't know, who required patience and understanding, and the willingness to enter a world that looked different from what most people expected family to look like. Her friend had convinced her to try this blind date with promises that Julian seemed like a good guy, seemed stable and kind and mature enough to handle complexity, had set it up without mentioning Grace because she'd worried that mentioning Grace up front would mean no one would ever agree to meet Natalie, would mean Natalie would spend the rest of her life alone because men ran from single mothers and ran even faster from children with disabilities. The babysitter had canceled at 6:45 p.m. with a family emergency that left Natalie with impossible mathematics, missed the first date she'd had in 5 years, and confirmed to herself that she'd never prioritize her own needs or bring Grace along and risk the humiliation of watching another man make polite excuses about early mornings or unexpected work emergencies before disappearing from her life before appetizers even arrived. She'd chosen to bring Grace because Grace had seen her getting ready and had asked in sign language if Mama was going somewhere special, and Natalie couldn't lie to those perceptive eyes, couldn't pretend this wasn't important, even though it would probably end in disappointment. She'd arrived 32 minutes late because getting a 7-year-old ready to go somewhere unexpected took time, and because she'd sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes trying to gather the courage to walk in with Grace and face whatever judgment or rejection waited inside. She expected Julian to leave, had steeled herself for that outcome, or had already prepared the explanation she'd give Grace about how some grown-ups had important things to do and couldn't stay for dinner, had the speech ready about how it wasn't Grace's fault and Mama loved her more than anyone in the world, and they didn't need anyone else to be happy. Grace was 7 years old and had been deaf since birth, communicated fluently in American Sign Language with a vocabulary and expressiveness that amazed the therapist who'd worked with her since she was a baby, was being raised bilingual in the way that deaf children of hearing parents learn to navigate 2 worlds simultaneously. Grace was very observant in ways that came from processing the world primarily through sight rather than sound. I read people's body language and facial expression with the precision of someone who learned early that communication happened in gestures and micro-expressions as much as in words, was shy but perceptive about whether adults could be trusted or whether they were the kind who smiled at her mother but looked uncomfortable when Grace herself approached. She carried a small notebook everywhere for drawing because drawing was how she processed her observations, how she communicated when sign language wasn't sufficient or when she wanted to show rather than tell. Loved her mother with the fierce protectiveness of a child who'd watched that mother sacrifice everything to create a life where Grace felt valued rather than burdensome. She rarely liked the few men her mother had tentatively dated over the years, could sense the ones who saw her as obstacle rather than person, who were dating her mother despite Grace rather than accepting that Grace and Natalie were a unit that couldn't be separated, was protective of her mother in ways that made Natalie's heart ache because 7-year-olds shouldn't need to screen their mother's potential partners. But Grace had learned early that not everyone stayed. The blind date was at Bella Rosa, an Italian restaurant that was nice enough to signal. This was a real date, but casual enough to not feel intimidating, at table 7 by the window, where Julian had been sitting alone wondering if he'd been stood up. He'd been about to leave when Natalie rushed in with Grace, about to settle his bill and write off the entire evening as another failure in his attempts to build something that resembled a life outside his work. Natalie arrived 32 minutes late with Grace in tow, approached Julian's table with apologies already forming, expected him to make the kind of polite excuses men always made when confronted with the reality that she came with complications, with a child who needed accommodations and patience and the willingness to learn an entirely new language. But Grace looked at Julian before Natalie could finish apologizing, studied him with those serious brown eyes that had learned to read adults with unnerving accuracy, watched how he stood when they approached, how his body language shifted from irritation at being kept waiting to something softer when he saw the child, in how his face showed confusion but not disgust, uncertainty but not rejection. And she signed to her mother with hands that moved through shapes Natalie could read even in her peripheral vision, signed the observation that would change everything. "He has kind eyes, Mommy. Have you ever been seen by someone who couldn't speak your language but understood you better than people who shared every word? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from." At 7:35 p.m., exactly 3 minutes after Julian had checked his watch and decided he'd given this blind date more than enough time to materialize before cutting his losses, he was standing beside table 7 with one hand already raised to signal the waiter when he saw a woman rush through the restaurant entrance looking simultaneously beautiful and completely overwhelmed. Her cheeks flushed from what must have been a sprint from the parking lot, blonde hair escaping from a bun that had probably looked elegant earlier, but now suggested chaos, wearing a navy dress that was elegant but wrinkled in ways that suggested she'd been wrestling with something or someone before arriving. She wasn't alone, was holding the hand of a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7, and Julian's first thought was confusion, because his friend Derek definitely hadn't mentioned anything about children when describing Natalie Brooks as a graphic designer who loved hiking and had a great sense of humor, and would probably appreciate Julian's tendency toward terrible puns. He realized this was his date when the woman's eyes scanned the restaurant with desperate urgency and landed on him standing at table 7. But when her expression shifted from general panic to specific mortification, when she started walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was preparing herself for rejection and was determined to face it with whatever dignity she could muster. Julian was confused in ways that made his carefully ordered mind struggle to process the unexpected variables, Confused because blind dates weren't supposed to include children. Confused because he'd been prepared for awkward conversation and potentially incompatible life goals, but not for the reality of a small human watching him with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for scientists observing specimens under microscopes. She was beautiful despite being flustered. Despite the escaped hair and the wrinkled dress and the obvious stress radiating from her in waves that Julian could read even from 10 feet away. Beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with the careful presentation people usually brought to first dates and everything to do with the authenticity of someone who'd clearly had an emergency and had chosen to show up anyway, rather than canceling or making excuses. The child was watching him intently with serious brown eyes that seemed to catalog every micro-expression on Julian's face, every shift in his posture, every signal that might indicate whether this stranger was safe or dangerous, kind or cruel, someone who would stay or someone who would leave the way Julian suspected other men had left before. "I'm so sorry I'm late," Natalie said when she reached the table. Her voice carrying genuine apology mixed with exhaustion and embarrassment. "The babysitter canceled last minute, and I didn't have your number to let you know, and I tried to get here as fast as I could, but everything went wrong, and I completely understand if you want to leave, if this is too much, if you have somewhere else you need to be." She was clearly expecting rejection, had the kind of braced posture that came from being disappointed so many times you learn to prepare for impact before it happened, was holding Grace's hand protectively in a way that suggested she was ready to shield her daughter from whatever disappointment was about to unfold. Grace was still watching Julian carefully, her small hands suddenly moving through the air with practiced fluidity, on fingers forming shapes that Julian didn't understand but recognized as language, as communication that was happening in a dimension he couldn't access, signing to her mother with the kind of urgent intensity that suggested whatever she was saying was important. Natalie's eyes widened as she watched her daughter's hands, something like surprise flickering across her face before being replaced by an expression Julian couldn't quite read. Something between hope and disbelief. She looked at Julian and translated in a voice that had gone quieter, more tentative. "She says you have kind eyes, Mommy." The words delivered like a gift or maybe a test. Like Natalie was waiting to see how Julian would respond to being evaluated by a 7-year-old, who'd formed an opinion based on nothing more than looking at his face for 30 seconds. Julian's mind was processing the situation with the systematic assessment he usually reserved for structural engineering problems, cataloging facts that needed to be weighed before making decisions that would have consequences he couldn't fully predict. She was 32 minutes late, which under normal circumstances would justify leaving, would validate his decision to settle the bill and go home and tell Derek this wasn't going to work. She'd brought her child to a blind date without warning or explanation, had fundamentally changed the parameters of what he'd agreed to, had introduced complexity that he had every right to reject. The child was deaf. He'd noticed that immediately from the way she communicated, from the focused way she watched faces, one from the sign language that flowed between mother and daughter like a second language that was actually their first. He could leave and be completely justified, could make polite excuses about early morning meetings or unexpected work emergencies, could extract himself from this situation that was already more complicated than anything he'd signed up for when he'd agreed to one simple dinner with a woman his friend thought he might like. But the child had just said something kind about him, had looked at his face and seen something worth commenting on, had called his eyes kind in a way that suggested she'd been looking for kindness, and had found it in a stranger who was seconds away from walking out. The child was watching him now, waiting to see what he would do, her expression serious but not anxious, observant but not afraid, and like she was gathering data about whether adults could be trusted to do the right thing, when the easy thing would be to disappoint her. If he left now, he would disappoint a child, would confirm whatever lessons this little girl had already learned about men who showed up in her mother's life briefly before vanishing, would be one more person who chose convenience over kindness. If he stayed, this would be complicated in ways he couldn't begin to calculate, would mean navigating not just the normal complexity of getting to know someone new, but the additional dimensions of a child and disability, and a life that looked nothing like what he'd imagined when he'd thought about dating again. But those words echoed in his head in ways he couldn't dismiss. Kind eyes, when had anyone last called him kind? When had anyone looked at him and seen something beyond his professional achievements, or his divorce, or his tendency to prioritize control over spontaneity? He couldn't leave now, not after a child had seen something in him that he'd forgotten he possessed, not when leaving would prove that she'd been wrong about the kindness, not when staying cost him nothing more than an evening and might mean everything to the woman standing in front of him, looking like she'd already prepared herself for rejection. Julian gestured to the chairs across from him, lowered his raised hand that had been signaling the waiter, made the decision in the space between one breath and the next. Please sit. The invitation, simple but weighted with significance because it meant he was choosing to stay when leaving, would have been easier. It choosing complexity over simplicity, choosing to see where this unexpected evening might lead. Natalie was shocked in ways that showed clearly on her face, her eyes widening and her shoulders dropping slightly as relief washed over her features. Relief so profound it suggested she'd expected rejection with absolute certainty and was struggling to process the reality that this stranger was actually inviting her to sit down, was choosing to stay despite the complications she'd brought with her. Grace climbed into the chair beside her mother with the careful precision of a child who'd learned to navigate adult spaces, pulled a small notebook and a pencil case from her mother's bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. He opened to a fresh page and began drawing with the kind of focused concentration that suggested she was content to observe while the adults talked. At 7:40 p.m., 5 minutes after Natalie and Grace had arrived and transformed Julian's planned exit into an unexpected beginning, dinner officially began with the kind of awkwardness that came from two people trying to navigate normal first date conversation, while a 7-year-old drew pictures between them and served as living reminder that nothing about the situation was normal. Natalie started explaining about Grace with the rushed urgency of someone who'd learned to front-load information before people could feel misled, explaining that Grace was deaf and had been born that way due to genetic factors, that she communicated through American Sign Language, that Natalie should have told Julian about her before tonight, but her friend had insisted on setting up the date without that detail because apparently honesty scared men away faster than surprised children at restaurants. I should have told you before, Natalie said, her voice carrying guilt and defensiveness in equal measure. Should have been upfront about Grace instead of letting you be ambushed. But I haven't dated in 5 years, and I didn't know the protocol for telling someone that dating me means dating both of us. It's okay, Julian replied, the words automatic but sincere because he genuinely didn't mind, even though he was nervous in ways that made his hands slightly unsteady. Nervous because he didn't know sign language and didn't know how to communicate with a deaf child, and didn't know if saying the wrong thing would offend or hurt, or reveal him as ignorant in ways that would end this dinner before it really started. Grace was observing everything with the quiet intensity of someone who'd learned to gather information through watching rather than hearing, was drawing in her notebook, but her eyes kept flicking up to Julian's face. Watching how he spoke to her mother, noticing his nervousness, but also noticing how he didn't look uncomfortable or disgusted or like he was planning his escape. Seeing his kindness in the way he smiled when he was uncertain, and the way he leaned forward when Natalie spoke, like what she was saying actually mattered to him. And the conversation began to flow more naturally as they discovered common ground, both working in creative fields that required visual thinking and problem solving. Julian designing buildings that were supposed to inspire human connection, and Natalie creating visual communications that were supposed to convey meaning without relying solely on words. We're both in the business of making people feel something without necessarily using language, Natalie observed, her expression brightening as she made the connection. You through space and light, and I through color and composition, both trying to create meaning that transcends the literal. Grace showed Julian her drawings without warning, pushed the notebook across the table with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she decided he was worth sharing with. It revealed sketches of the restaurant interior rendered with the kind of detail that was impressive for a 7-year-old, had captured the hanging lights and the checkered tablecloths and the couple at the next table with surprising accuracy. Julian asked about Grace with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation, asked how they communicated and what it was like raising a deaf child, and whether Grace could read lips or if sign language was the primary mode of conversation. Natalie explained American Sign Language with the enthusiasm of someone who'd fallen in love with the beauty of a visual language, demonstrated some basic signs with hands that moved gracefully through the air, showed Julian how to sign hello and thank you in beautiful, simple words that felt profound when expressed through gesture rather than sound. Julian tried to learn with the kind of earnest concentration he brought to understanding architectural principles, attempted to copy Natalie's hand shapes, and laughed when his fingers tangled or formed shapes that apparently meant something completely different from what he'd intended. Grace giggled silently when Julian accidentally signed something that made Natalie blush and quickly correct his hand position, her shoulders shaking with laughter that had no sound, but was completely genuine, her eyes crinkling with delight at this grown man who was willing to look foolish while learning her language. At 8:15 p.m., 45 minutes into a dinner that was supposed to have ended before it began, the connection was deepening in ways that surprised both Julian and Natalie, was moving beyond polite first date small talk into territory that felt raw and real. Natalie opened up about her ex-husband with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd processed the anger and hurt enough to talk about it without breaking. Explained that he'd left when Grace was 2 years old after the diagnosis and the initial interventions, had said he didn't sign up for a child with special needs, had said he couldn't handle the stress and the financial burden and the reality that their life would never be normal, whatever normal meant. Most men run when they see Grace, Natalie added, her voice carrying years of accumulated disappointment. Run when they realize that dating me means learning sign language and attending therapy appointments, and accepting that Grace will always be my priority, way that she comes first before romantic relationships or personal desires or anything else. Julian felt anger flash through him, hot and protective. Anger at the men who'd run. Anger at Natalie's ex-husband who'd abandoned his own child because she required more effort than he'd wanted to give. Anger at a world that treated disability as burden rather than just a different way of experiencing life. Julian shared his own story with matching honesty, told Natalie about his divorce 3 years ago from a woman who'd wanted children while Julian had insisted he needed to focus on establishing his career first, about how he'd prioritized professional achievement over building a family until his wife had finally left to find someone whose priorities aligned with hers. Biggest regret of my life, Julian admitted, So he voiced rough with emotion he usually kept carefully controlled. I thought I had all the time in the world to have children later. Thought establishing my career was the responsible choice. But I was wrong, and by the time I realized it, she was gone. And I was alone with a successful career and no one to share it with. No kids to build blanket forts with or teach to ride bikes or any of the things I thought I'd eventually get around to doing. Grace suddenly pushed her notebook toward Julian with the kind of insistence that suggested this was important, pointed at a blank space on the page and then at the pencil, a clear invitation for him to participate in whatever she was creating. Julian drew badly, his architectural training completely failing him when it came to freehand sketching. I produced a lopsided flower that looked more like a geometric disaster than anything natural. Grace signed something with hands that moved quickly, her expression serious, and Natalie laughed with genuine delight before translating. She says you're better at buildings than at flowers, which is probably true based on that drawing. The natural family feeling that had developed over the course of dinner surprised Julian with its ease and authenticity, surprised him because he'd expected awkwardness and obligation, but instead found conversation that flowed naturally. Found himself including Grace in questions and comments, not because he was trying to impress Natalie, but because Grace herself was interesting, was a person worth knowing beyond being Natalie's daughter. He asked Grace questions and waited while Natalie translated. He asked about her favorite subjects in school and what she liked to draw and whether she had friends who also signed, treated her as a participant in the conversation rather than an observer or an obstacle. Grace was warming up to him in ways Natalie recognized as rare and significant, was engaging rather than withdrawing, was sharing her drawings and her observations and her silent giggles in ways she rarely did with strangers, especially strangers who showed up as potential complications in her carefully constructed world with her mother. 3 dates later, after 3 weeks of seeing each other regularly in ways that had transformed from tentative first steps into something that felt increasingly like building a foundation, Julian and Natalie were officially dating, though neither had used that word explicitly. Whilst we're spending weekends together and weeknight dinners and stolen coffee breaks between work obligations, we're becoming part of each other's daily rhythms in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Julian was learning American Sign Language secretly, was watching YouTube tutorials at midnight and practicing finger spelling during his morning commute, and studying vocabulary lists while pretending to review architectural plans, was determined to communicate directly with Grace rather than always relying on Natalie to translate, wanted to be able to tell Grace himself that her drawings were beautiful, or ask her about her day or sign I love you when the moment felt right, even though that moment hadn't arrived yet, because 3 weeks felt too soon to say those words even in sign language. Grace loved him with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who decided Julian was safe and kind and worth keeping, would run to hug him when he arrived for dinner and insist he sit beside her, while she showed him her latest drawings and signed to him, even though he couldn't understand most of what she was saying, seemed to trust that he was trying to learn and that effort mattered as much as fluency. Natalie was falling for him in ways that terrified her, because falling meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of being hurt again, was falling despite her better judgment and her history and her determination to protect both herself and Grace from the inevitable disappointment that came when men realized that loving her meant accepting Grace as part of the package. But she was scared in ways that made her wake up at 3 a.m., cataloging all the reasons this couldn't work. All the ways Julian would eventually realize he'd made a mistake. All the patterns she'd seen before, when men had seemed interested until the reality of her life became too complicated and they'd found reasons to slowly distance themselves before disappearing entirely. "What if you change your mind?" Natalie asked one evening after Grace had gone to bed and they were sitting on her couch drinking wine and pretending to watch a movie. Neither was paying attention to. "What if you wake up in 6 months and realize this is too much work? That Grace requires too much accommodation? That building a life with us is harder than you thought, and you'd rather find someone without complications?" "Grace is getting attached to you," Natalie continued, voice cracking slightly with fear she'd been holding inside for weeks. "She talks about you constantly and draws pictures of the three of us together and asks when you're coming over, and I can't let her be hurt when you decide this isn't what you want anymore. Can't watch her lose another person who mattered to her. Can't explain again why someone left." "I'm not going anywhere," Julian said with conviction he hoped was convincing, because he meant it even though some small part of him was also terrified of the responsibility he was taking on. "Not going anywhere because what we're building matters to me in ways nothing has mattered since my divorce. Because Grace and you have become the best parts of my week, and I'm not interested in walking away from that." The test came 2 weeks later when Natalie's ex-husband returned after 5 years of minimal contact, appeared without warning, demanding to be part of Grace's life again, with lawyers and mediation requests and threats about parental rights he'd abandoned years ago, wanted back in now that Grace was older and easier, and he'd remarried someone who thought having a stepdaughter would be nice without understanding the work that came with it. Natalie was stressed in ways that made her lose weight and sleep, and the ability to focus on anything beyond the legal nightmare unfolding was overwhelmed by custody evaluations and mediator appointments and the emotional toll of having to interact with a man who'd abandoned their daughter but was now claiming he deserved equal time and decision-making power. It's Julian supported her through every meeting and every lawyer consultation and every moment of panic when Natalie was convinced she'd lose custody to a man who'd never learned more than basic sign language and didn't understand Grace's needs. Went to mediation sessions with her even though he had no legal standing. Sat beside her while her ex-husband argued that Grace needed a father figure and a stable 2-parent household that he could now provide with his new wife. He stood by her side literally and figuratively, held her hand during breaks when she was shaking with anger and fear, reminded her that she'd been Grace's entire world for 5 years, and that wouldn't be erased by legal proceedings. It helped her prepare responses to accusations that single motherhood was inherently inferior to the intact family her ex-husband was suddenly offering. Grace's reaction to her biological father was immediate and visceral, was hiding behind furniture when he tried to approach her during supervised visits, was refusing to make eye contact or engage with his attempts at signing basic greetings or accept the gifts he brought as peace offerings that felt more like bribes. The ex-husband tried to interact during one particularly awful visit at a family therapy office, tried to sign hello and "How are you?" with hands that were clumsy and unpracticed. Tried to offer Grace a stuffed animal that she refused to take. Tried to position himself as the dad who was ready now, even though he hadn't been ready when it mattered. Grace ran to Julian, who was sitting in the waiting room, reading architectural magazines and pretending he wasn't listening to every word coming from the therapy room, hid behind Julian's chair with her small hands gripping his arm, signed to him with urgency that cut through his limited vocabulary. "Stay with me." The words clear enough that Julian understood without Natalie translating. Understood that Grace was asking him to protect her from the stranger who claimed to be her father, but felt nothing like safety or home. Julian realized in that moment that he'd become Grace's father figure without consciously deciding to take on that role. Had become the person she ran to when scared, the person she trusted to keep her safe, or the person who occupied the dad-shaped space in her life that her biological father had abandoned and was now trying to reclaim without having earned it. The responsibility hit him with the weight of a building collapsing. hit him because being Grace's trusted adult wasn't just about fun dinners and drawing sessions, was about being the person she depended on when life was terrifying, was about potentially having legal and emotional responsibilities that would shape the rest of his life in ways he'd never planned for. Did he want this? Did he want to be the father figure to a 7-year-old deaf girl who came with custody battles and ex-husband drama and a lifetime of therapy appointments and advocacy? Hey, did he want to sign up for complexity that went so far beyond what he'd imagined when he'd agreed to one blind date with a woman his friend thought he might like? Julian's crisis unfolded over the next week as he processed what staying actually meant, what it would require of him, not just emotionally but practically and legally, and in terms of the life he'd have to build around Grace's needs rather than his own preferences. He was scared of the responsibility in ways he hadn't anticipated, scared of failing Grace the way his own father had failed him, by being physically present but emotionally absent, scared of failing Natalie, who trusted him with the most precious thing in her life, and was depending on him to not be like all the other men who disappeared when things got complicated. Scared that he'd say yes to all of this, and then discover he wasn't capable of being the father Grace deserved. What if he failed them? What if his good intentions weren't enough? What if he was repeating his pattern of prioritizing his own comfort over commitment and would eventually find reasons to extract himself from this family he'd been building with Natalie and Grace? This was real fatherhood he was contemplating, not the abstract concept of maybe having kids someday when it was convenient, not just dating a woman who happened to have a child, but actually becoming a parent to a child with specific needs and trauma, and a biological father who was trying to reassert himself, and a whole complex history that Julian couldn't erase or fix simply by showing up. This wasn't just dating anymore. It was crossing a threshold into territory that would define the rest of his life, would mean choosing Grace and Natalie over the easier path of finding someone without these particular complications. He pulled away slightly without consciously deciding to create distance, started being less available for weeknight dinners, canceled one Saturday plan with an excuse about work deadlines that wasn't entirely false, but wasn't entirely honest either. Found himself hesitating before answering Natalie's texts in ways he hadn't hesitated before the mediation sessions had made everything feel overwhelmingly real. Natalie noticed immediately because she'd been watching for exactly these signs, or had been waiting for the moment when Julian would start pulling away the way every other man had pulled away, when her life stopped being fun and started being complicated. Noticed that his responses were shorter and his availability was limited, and his enthusiasm seemed forced rather than genuine. Julian was more distant in ways that felt familiar and devastating, was exhibiting the exact pattern she'd seen before when men who'd seemed interested suddenly realized what they'd signed up for and started slowly extracting themselves from her life, was probably already mentally composing the breakup conversation about how he cared about her. But this was moving too fast, or he wasn't ready for the responsibility, or he'd realized he wanted something different. She knew this pattern because she'd lived it 3 times before. She knew that men left when it got real, when Grace stopped being a cute addition to their dates and started being a child with complex needs who would always be Natalie's priority, when the ex-husband drama and the custody battles and the constant advocacy required to navigate the world as a deaf child's parent became too exhausting for men who'd signed up for romance, not responsibility. Natalie prepared herself to be abandoned again, started building the emotional walls that would protect her heart when Julian finally admitted he couldn't do this, started preparing the explanation she'd give Grace about how Julian had to go away for work, or had decided he needed to focus on his career, or whatever lie felt kinder than the truth that he'd left, because loving them required more than he was willing to give. 1 week later, after 7 days of Julian trying to convince himself that pulling away was the responsible choice when he wasn't certain he could be what Grace and Natalie needed. After 7 days of throwing himself into work and staying late at the office and avoiding the apartment that felt emptier than it ever had before, his life had been filled with a 7-year-old's silent giggles and a woman's understanding smile. He realized he couldn't stop thinking about them in ways that made concentration impossible and sleep elusive, and everything else feel hollow and pointless. He missed Grace's giggles, missed the way her whole body shook with silent laughter when he did something silly, missed her serious brown eyes watching him with complete trust, missed the drawings she'd leave on his kitchen table when they visited, missed the way she'd sign good morning to him even though he could barely understand, and she knew it, but signed anyway because she was teaching him her language one gesture at a time. He missed Natalie's smile, the real one that appeared when she forgot to be guarded, missed the way she'd rest her head on his shoulder during movies, and the way she'd explain her design projects with the same passion he felt for architecture. Missed the conversations that lasted until midnight about everything and nothing. Missed feeling like he was part of something that mattered more than corner offices and award-winning buildings. He realized with the clarity that comes from absence that he loved them, loved both of them, not as separate entities he was trying to connect with, but as a unit he wanted to be part of. Loved Grace's fierce intelligence and Natalie's quiet strength, and the family they'd built from nothing but determination and hope in each other. He loved them in ways that terrified him, but that terror wasn't a reason to run, wasn't justification for abandoning people who mattered because commitment felt overwhelming, wasn't an excuse to repeat the pattern that had destroyed his marriage when he'd chosen career safety over the vulnerability of building a family. Fear was just fear, was something to feel and acknowledge, and then move through rather than allowing it to make his decisions for him. And what he feared more than the responsibility of becoming Grace's father was the regret of walking away from the best thing that had happened to him since he'd stopped believing good things could happen at all. When Julian showed up at their apartment on a Sunday morning without warning or elaborate planning, showed up with his heart hammering and his carefully rehearsed words already dissolving because seeing Natalie open the door with surprise and wariness and hurt in her eyes made all his preparation feel inadequate. But he had a surprise that went beyond just appearing after a week of distance, had something he'd been working on for months in secret, had been learning American Sign Language, not just through apps and videos, but through actual classes with a tutor who'd helped him achieve fluency that went beyond basic vocabulary into actual conversation, into the ability to communicate directly with Grace without Natalie translating, into speaking the language that was Grace's first language and would always be the truest way to reach her. When Grace appeared behind her mother, cautious but hopeful, and Julian dropped to his knees to be at her eye level, began signing directly to her with hands that moved with practiced confidence he'd earned through hours of study and repetition. "I'm sorry I was scared," Julian signed, his hands forming the shapes he'd practiced 1,000 times. "Sorry I pulled away when things got hard. Sorry I made you think I was leaving like other people have left. But I was wrong to be scared because fear is nothing compared to how much I love you and your mommy." Grace's eyes went wide as she realized he was signing to her fluently, was using her language without hesitation or mistakes, was communicating in the way that mattered most to her, and tears started streaming down her face as she launched herself at him and wrapped her small arms around his neck with the kind of fierce hug that said everything words couldn't express. Julian held her while she cried and signed against his shoulder, signed "I love you" back to him over and over, signed "You came back and you didn't leave, and I knew you had kind eyes," signed with the emotional honesty that children possess before learning to guard their hearts against disappointment. Natalie was crying too, standing in the doorway watching this man she'd thought was leaving, prove that she'd been wrong, watching him communicate with her daughter in the language she'd spent 7 years learning and defending and insisting mattered even when the world suggested spoken language was superior, and watching him choose them with actions that spoke louder than any promises he could have made. 6 months later, after 6 months of Julian becoming fully integrated into their lives in ways that felt permanent and right, after custody mediation had ended with Natalie maintaining primary custody because Grace's preference had been crystal clear about who she considered her real father, after Julian had started keeping a toothbrush at Natalie's apartment, and Natalie had a drawer at his place, and they'd stopped pretending they weren't building towards something permanent, Julian took them back to Bella Rosa restaurant and requested table 7 where everything had started, where a blind date that should have ended before it began had transformed into the foundation of a family. Grace knew something was happening because Julian had that particular nervousness that adults got before important moments, was practically vibrating with excitement as they sat at the same table where she'd first signed that Julian had kind eyes, where her mother had expected rejection and had found acceptance instead. Julian had practiced this moment for weeks, had involved Grace in the planning, because what he was asking affected her as much as it affected Natalie, had bought a ring and prepared words and made sure Grace understood her crucial role in what was about to happen. He nodded to Grace, who pulled a small velvet box from her pocket with the solemnity of a child entrusted with something precious, handed it to her mother with a smile that was pure joy and mischief combined. Natalie opened the box with shaking hands and found a ring that was simple and beautiful and exactly right. Looked at Julian with questions in her eyes that he answered by signing not speaking, by using the language that had become theirs, by asking her to marry him in the way that honored who they were as a family. Then he turned to Grace and signed with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. "Can I be your daddy, not just the man who loves your mommy, but your actual father, the person who will be there for every school play and every doctor's appointment and every moment when you need someone to believe in you?" Grace signed back immediately without hesitation. "You already are. You've been my daddy since you stayed that first night, since you learned my language, since you chose us." The official part is just paperwork, and the wedding was small ceremony 4 months later with just close friends and family who understood what this union represented, was celebration not just of Julian and Natalie's love, but of the family they'd built through choice and effort, and the decision to keep showing up, even when showing up was terrifying. Grace served as flower girl wearing a purple dress she'd chosen herself, walked down the aisle scattering rose petals with the kind of serious concentration she brought to everything important, stood beside her mother during the vows and signed "I love you" to both of them. When the officiant asked if anyone had anything to add, signed it with hands that were steady and certain, because she knew without doubt that she was loved back. Julian signed back to her perfectly. His ASL fluent enough now that he could express complex emotions and tell her stories and argue about homework and do all the normal parent-child communication that happened in their house in a language that was visual rather than verbal. Signed "I love you too" with the same certainty Grace had shown. Signed it in front of everyone witnessing this marriage as proof that he was committing not just to Natalie, but to Grace, to being the father she deserved. Even though biology hadn't made them family, love had. The family was complete in ways that transcended traditional definitions, was complete because it had been built intentionally through choices made every day to stay and learn and grow, and love even when easier paths presented themselves. To 2 years after the wedding, Julian had legally adopted Grace through a process that had required her biological father to relinquish parental rights he'd barely exercised, and had involved Grace testifying to a judge about who she considered her real father and why, had changed her last name to Hayes, and made official what had been true since the night Julian had knelt in her living room and signed his apology and his love in the language she understood best. Natalie was pregnant with their son, was carrying the baby that would make their family of 3 into a family of 4, was glowing with the particular joy of someone who'd thought her family was complete, but was discovering it could expand in new ways. Narana Grace was excited about becoming a big sister with an enthusiasm that involved making lists of everything she'd teach the baby and preparing signs she'd use to communicate with him before he could speak, was already teaching baby sign language to a teddy bear she designated as practice for the real thing, was determined that her little brother would grow up bilingual in spoken English and American Sign Language, because being able to communicate in multiple ways was a gift, not a limitation. Julian had become an architect who learned that love had no words, that the most important conversations happened in gestures and presence and the choice to keep showing up, that buildings were just structures, but families were what made those structures into homes. And that success wasn't measured in awards or recognition, but in a 7-year-old signing, "I love you, Daddy," and meaning it with every fiber of her being. Their family had been built on kindness, on a child's observation about a stranger's eyes, on a man's decision to stay when leaving would have been justified, on a woman's willingness to trust again after being betrayed, on the daily choice to love even when love required learning new languages and navigating custody battles, and accepting that families came in forms that looked nothing like the traditional scripts society provided. At the restaurant where they returned every year for their anniversary, sitting at table 7, where Grace had first changed Julian's life with 5 signed words, Grace signed to both her parents. "Remember when you stayed. Remember when you could have left but chose us instead. Remember when everything changed because you saw past the complications to what mattered." Julian signed back, "Best decision I ever made. Staying with your mother and you that night, learning your language, becoming your father, building this life we have now. Your eyes saw my heart before I knew what was in it. Saw the kindness I'd forgotten I possessed. Saw the father I could become if I was brave enough to choose love over fear." Grace signed with the wisdom that sometimes appeared in children who'd learned early that life required courage. "Kind eyes don't lie. You showed me who you were that first night, and you've been that person every day since. You're my daddy not because papers say so, but because you chose to be. Edie, because you learned to speak with your hands so you could talk to me in my language. Because you stayed when staying was hard." And Julian realized as he sat with his wife and his daughter and the son growing inside Natalie, who would be born into a family that valued communication in all its forms, that Grace had been right that first night when she'd seen something in him that he'd stopped seeing in himself. That kindness was the foundation everything else was built on. That sometimes the greatest architecture wasn't the buildings you designed, but the family you built one choice at a time. When Julian Hayes stood to leave his blind date after 32 minutes of waiting alone at table 7 in Bella Rosa restaurant, after checking his watch 4 times and composing the polite excuse text he'd send his friend Derek, after deciding this was another evening wasted on someone who didn't respect his time enough to show up when they said they would, or at least send a message explaining the delay, Natalie Brooks rushed in breathless and flustered with her 7-year-old deaf daughter Grace, holding her hand because the babysitter had canceled, and she'd had to choose between missing her first date in 5 years or bringing her child and hoping the stranger would understand. And Grace looked at Julian with serious brown eyes that cataloged everything about him in seconds. looked past his irritation and his expensive watch and his carefully pressed shirt to something deeper, signed to her mother with small, careful hands that moved through shapes Julian didn't understand yet, but would spend months learning because those shapes would become his second language. "He has kind eyes, Mommy." Words that stopped Julian mid-exit because when had anyone last called him kind? When had anyone seen past his punctuality obsession and his architect perfectionism and his carefully constructed life to something essential he'd forgotten he possessed? And he sat back down for a woman he didn't know, and a child who couldn't hear him speak but could see him more clearly than anyone had seen him in years, sat back down and ordered dinner and asked questions and learned that connection came in unexpected forms. Learned American Sign Language in secret through midnight tutorials and weekend classes, and a tutor who helped him achieve fluency because actions mattered more than words. And if he was going to love this child, he needed to speak her language, not expect her to accommodate his. He stood beside Natalie through custody battles with an ex-husband who'd abandoned them when Grace's disability became real and inconvenient, but wanted back in when it suited his image of himself as a good father, stood in mediation rooms and family therapy sessions and court hearings as the man who'd chosen to be Grace's father when her biological father had chosen to leave, became the father Grace had never had not, because biology demanded it, but because love chose it, because Grace had seen his heart before he'd even known she was watching, because sometimes the family you're meant to find comes in unexpected packages that look nothing like what you planned, because the connections that change everything start with a child who speaks without sound but sees straight through to your soul, who signs 5 words that transform a failed blind date into the beginning of a family, who teaches you that kindness is a language everyone understands if they're willing to learn it, who shows you that the eyes really are windows to the soul, and 7-year-olds who've learned to read faces because they can't hear voices can see truth that adults have learned to hide, and because sometimes staying when you plan to leave is the decision that defines the rest of your life in ways that build buildings never could, in ways that professional success never will, in ways that matter more than anything you thought mattered before a child told her mother you had kind eyes and gave you the chance to prove her right. If this story reminded you that the best connections often come when we're ready to give up, that children see what adults miss, that love requires learning new languages and staying when leaving would be easier, that families are built through choice, not just biology, then you know why stories like this need to reach people who are standing at their own table, 7 deciding whether to stay or leave, who are one decision away from the family they didn't know they needed, who need to believe that being seen by someone who communicates differently can change everything if you're brave enough to stay and learn their language and choose them, even when choosing them means choosing complexity over convenience, permanence over the easy exit, love that requires effort over love that fits neatly into plans you made before you knew what love actually required. Have you ever been truly seen by someone who couldn't speak your language but understood you better than people who shared every word? Ever had a child change your life with a single observation? Ever stayed when leaving would have been justified and discovered that staying was the best decision you ever made? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and rate this story from 0 to 10, because your engagement reminds us that stories about unexpected families and languages that transcend words and kindness, that changes everything, still matter in a world that too often values convenience over commitment and plans over the beautiful accidents that happen when we're brave enough to stay when we plan to leave.